is right. So good evening. It's wonderful to see you all here tonight. Thank you so much for being here on this rainy afternoon and evening. Really, you're very committed. You're here in the rain and everything. So good evening. My name is Eva Zaki. I serve as the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at Millersville University. And it is my great honor to welcome you to the kickoff event of Millersville University's 40th Conference on the Holocaust and Genocide under the theme The Children of Survivors of the Holocaust and Genocide, Reflection and Remembrance. In our selection of the theme for this year, the organizing committee was guided by the realization that we are rapidly approaching the moment for when we will have lost the last survivor of the Holocaust. So the responsibility for remembrance and continued reminder about the impact and magnitude of the genocide against Jews is increasingly falling onto the descendants of the survivors. So the conference this year will address various aspects of the survivors' responsibility as well as their understanding of the process of this important and complex experience of bearing witness. And our speakers already talked about the importance of bearing witness with the students just before the beginning of this lecture. So as noted, this evening begins this year's events. We have multiple events planned. Our speakers today worked with teachers and teacher candidates just before the lecture on how to utilize the testimonies expressed in different literary and visual genres in their teaching about the Holocaust. We are now very eager to hear from them in this public lecture. But please also be on a lookout for 2 additional events planned for this year. We expect a writer and widely recognized publicist, Yossi Klein Halevi, to speak about his experience of being a son of a Holocaust survivor and how that has shaped his political, moral, and spiritual outlook. This event will be in the spring. And the lecture will then be followed by a showing of a movie, Kaddish, with pre-screening panel and post-screening conversation with the director. So as I said, tonight is the beginning of a series of events that constitute the conference together as one year-long event for all of us. Today's event, as well as the rest of the conference this year, would not be possible without the ongoing support of our generous donors. The teacher workshop and lecture tonight is sponsored by the Jewish Community Alliance of Lancaster under the leadership of Miriam Baumgarten, and she is over there, waving again. Thank you, Miriam. We are very, very grateful for the strong connection that we've been able to develop through the intersection between JCAL's commitment to education about the Holocaust and our college's mission. Today's event was also sponsored by private donor Mrs. Eleanor Isaacson, as well as other private donors. And I truly appreciate the marketing that was around town about this event. That would not have happened without the strong support from donors who are in this room. So thank you. In addition to our generous contributors, the conference would not be possible without dedication of the members of the conference committee. It is notable that the committee consists of the university faculty and staff, as well as representatives of the broader community. This year's conference committee is chaired by Dr. Victoria Kitterer and Barry Kornhauser. They're working on this together, so huge thanks to both of them. The membership of the committee also includes Dr. Kasha Yakubiak, Dr. Sarah Brooks, Dr. Tanya Kevorkian, along with such important figures in the community as Rabbi Paskov, and Miriam Baumgarten was also a member of the committee. Many thanks to all of you for your continued effort and support for this critically important event, not only for our campus, but for the wider community as well. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce the co-chairs of the committee, Dr. Victoria Kitterer and Barry Kornhauser, who will present to you this evening's speakers. So thank you.
My name is Victoria Kitterer, and I would like to remind you that on on these days, 83 years ago, September 29 and 30th, was the largest Holocaust massacre in the territory of Soviet Union, Babi Yar massacre. And I'm a child and grandchild of Holocaust survivors. My parents basically, that were 2 and 4 years old, by miracle escaped from Ukraine to interior of Soviet Union. And my mother always told me that she is the luckiest person in the world because she survived, and more than half of Jews of Ukraine perished in Holocaust. This is why the topic of conference so meaningful for me. And my great pleasure to introduce Victoria Arons, who holds the position of Mitchell Distinguished Professor of Literature at Trinity University, San Antonio, Texas, where she teaches courses on American Jewish and Holocaust literature. In addition to over 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, she is the author or editor of 12 books, including most recent third generation Holocaust representation. Also, she is author of several other books, The New Diaspora, Challenging Landscape of American Jewish Fiction, Third Generation Holocaust Narratives, Memory in Memoir and Fiction, Holocaust Graphic Narratives, Generation Trauma and Memory, the Berger Handbook of Holocaust Literature and Culture, and Memory Spaces, Visualizing Identity in Jewish Women's Graphic Narratives. She is on the editor board of Philip Roth Studies in American Jewish Literature, Partial Answers, and Women in Judaism. And she's a series editor for Lexington Studies in Jewish Literature. She serves on the San Antonio Holocaust Memorial Museum Commission. Her edited collection of essays, The Stories Not Over, Jewish Women and Embodied Selfhood in Graphic Narratives, is forthcoming in early 2025. And Barry Konhauser will present our second speaker, Dr. Alan L. Berger.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks everybody for being here tonight. I think you're in for a very engaging evening based on what we experienced in the teacher workshop a short while ago. Dr. Zaki gave me the honor and privilege of introducing one other guest in the audience, and that's Alan Loss, who is responsible for, with his wife, for our keynote address every year, and we hope to come back for that. So thank you, Alan. And one final note, I'm reminded of this by my wife, who's in the audience, who's always more on the ball than I am, that we should all be turning off our cell phones if we haven't already. So thank you. Dr. Alan L. Berger occupies the Raddick Family Eminent Scholar Chair for Holocaust Studies, the first such chair established in the state of Florida, and he directs the Center for the Study of Values and Violence After Auschwitz. Prior to this, Dr. Berger was a professor in the Department of Religion at Syracuse University, where he also served as co-program chair of the university's Lessons and Legacies of the Holocaust Conference. In 1988 and 89, Dr. Berger was visiting Gemunich Associate Professor of Judaica at the College of William and Mary. Among his dozens of books are Crisis and Covenant, Children of Job, with a foreword by Elie Wiesel himself. This book, in fact, was discussed in the New York Times article about the second generation. He and his wife Naomi co-edited Second Generation Voices, Reflections of Children of Holocaust Survivors and Perpetrators. It was the winner of the B'nai Zion National Media Award in 2002. He also co-edited the Encyclopedia of Holocaust Literature, which received a Booklist Best Reference Book in 2002 and the Outstanding Reference Source Award a year later. Another book of his is Trialogue and Terror, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam Respond to 9/11. Dr. Berger edited and wrote a chapter for Post-Holocaust Jewish-Christian Dialogue After the Flood, Before the Rainbow. He is co-author with Victoria Arons, here with us tonight, of Third Generation Holocaust Representation, Trauma, History, and Memory, published by Northwestern University Press. 2 volumes on Elie Wiesel, followed with Dr. Berger serving as editor and chapter contributor to Elie Wiesel, Teacher, Mentor, and Friend, Reflections by Readers of the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity Ethics Essay Contest, and as author of Elie Wiesel, Humanist Messenger for Peace, as part of the Routledge Press Historical American Series in 2021. Continuing this role as a co-editor, Dr. Berger contributed to Lexington Books' 2023 Emerging Trends in Third Generation Holocaust Literature, and his many articles and reviews continue to appear in a variety of national publications. Berger was interviewed by Renee Montaigne on NPR's Morning Edition in conjunction with the 60th anniversary of the Soviet Army's capture of Auschwitz. He received his degree of letters honoris causa from Luther College. Dr. Berger is also the recipient of an award honoring him for his distinguished contribution to Holocaust and Jewish literature, research, and education. And he also notes that he was born at an early age. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Berger and Dr. Ahrens.
Thank you, Victoria and Barry. And thank you all for coming to hear us talk about our favorite subject. When we were invited, we thought that instead of one of us giving a formal lecture and sitting down, and then the other standing up and giving a formal lecture and sitting down, that we would hold this more as a conversation. And Alan and I have been talking about Holocaust literature and also the second generation and the third generation for decades now. And so we thought we would continue the discussion with you. And so we will talk for about 40 minutes and then open it up to questions. And there's so many ways of talking about the Holocaust and Holocaust literature, which is just a huge subject and can cover everything from memoirs and short stories and poetry and novels. And we thought, given the topic for this year's conference, we wanted to talk about the intergenerational transmission of Holocaust memory and trauma. And we want to talk about literature as forms of witnessing and testimony. And especially given the place where we are in history right now, a time that will see the end of direct survivor testimony, since even those child survivors are coming to the ends of their lives. And one of the questions for us is, how do we talk about the Holocaust now? In 2024, how are writers taking on the enormity of the subject of the Holocaust as it recedes into history? And so what we want to do is to move from eyewitness testimony to second generation, the children of survivors, to the third generation, the grandchildren of survivors, and that generation, whether there's a familial connection or not, to the Holocaust. And we want to talk about testimony as storytelling. One of the really exciting things for me about the study of Holocaust literature is that it's so far-reaching in terms of the various disciplines it draws from. I mean, when I teach Holocaust literature, when I write about Holocaust literature, I'm also engaging Holocaust history and psychology, and so all of these different disciplines and ways of approaching the subject come into play in, I think, really dynamic and exciting ways, and we hope to transmit that in our discussion. And one last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Alan, and then we can look at some slides, is that as we were talking about with the students before coming here into the lecture hall, one of the challenges for teaching the Holocaust and studying the Holocaust and Holocaust narratives is the relation between Holocaust history, with a capital H, the hugeness, the enormity that begins really in 1933 with burning of books and one might say ends in 45 with the end of the war. But of course, the tentacles of the Holocaust reach far beyond the end of the war. We're almost 80 years out, and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are trying to place themselves in that legacy and continue the narratives of their grandparents. But so we're talking about narration and storytelling as a form of testimony. But as the late Israeli psychologist Dan Bar-On has said, there are, to be sure, historical truths, what happened, but there are also narrative truths, how someone tells what happened, how that story is transmitted, and how, in fact, it is through such intergenerational transmission that one generation's story can influence and shape the stories and the lives of subsequent generations.
Thank you. I think that what we're dealing with is story. And Elie Wiesel frequently referred to himself as a Magid, a storyteller. What is it about stories that makes us so interested in them? Well, a story, unlike a learned essay, is open-ended. Forces us to ask questions. And I think questions are far more important than answers. For example, National Socialism, the Nazis had an answer to the Jewish problem. It was their problem. That answer was extermination. Answers frequently kill. Questions keep the discussion going. Every one of us as a human being has certain fundamental, basic questions about the meaning of life, about how to raise children, about how to educate children, about how to be educated by our children. These are common human issues. All of us face them. We have different responses to them, but what unites us are the questions. And questions, of course, contains the word quest. We're on a quest to find out things. And sometimes this quest can last a lifetime. And it's up to us to bear the burden of the quest. Moreover, if you think about the Holocaust literature, which, as Vicki says, is a vast corpus of material, short stories, poems, films, movies, the issue is that we are in dialogue with this material. And to be in dialogue means a couple of things. First and foremost, you learn about the other. What are they talking about? Why should I care? Why should they care about me? Secondly, we learn about ourselves. When we are compelled to say what it is that we believe in, we start thinking about things seriously. And this is a good thing. Sometimes we think about them seriously for the first time. The dialogue is what's important. It keeps the discussion going. We don't know exactly where the dialogue ends, or more precisely, it never ends, because dialogue means growth. Sometimes growth is painful. Remember when your children, for those of you who have such creatures, when they first went to the dentist, all the agony. This is before they gave out lollipops. But the issue is growth sometimes is painful. One of the films, plays actually, that film that we discussed was by Arnon Goldfinger, an Israeli playwright who's a member of the third generation. And the movie opens with him accompanying his mother to his grandfather's flat, a dirah, the flat in Hebrew. And his mother, the second generation, starts gathering up all of the remnants of her parents' lives puts them in garbage bags and starts throwing them out. I don't want this narrative. I reject it. Arnon Goldfinger goes and retrieves the garbage bags. He wants to find out more about his grandparents who were survivors. The other thing about this film, and if you haven't seen it yet, please do make an effort to see it or live stream it or however you access films, is that Arnon Goldfinger's grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And his grandfather was a close friend of a high-ranking Nazi. It's just remarkable. Truth is always stranger than fiction. And to make a long story shorter, Goldfinger goes to Germany and has a meeting with the daughter of the high-ranking Nazi. And they get along famously until Goldfinger starts asking her about her parents. And the daughter refuses to acknowledge that her father was a Nazi. And this causes great tension between the two. What does it mean to confront history, even in the form of a film or novel or short story? Because these stories and films frequently grapple with what is inexpressible. And they leave us, the audience, to involve ourselves in trying to unpack what just happened, what we just saw. How do we relate to this material? How does it define us? How does it deal with us as second and third-hand witnesses? What does it do to our agency? And there's a big theoretical discussion about this, which Vicky has established for us, and that is the issue of the second generation, the children of survivors, having their own memories evacuated and being replaced by the memories of their parents. That is contrasted with Eva Hoffman, who wrote a book called Living After. What does it mean to live after the Holocaust? Eva Hoffman says, well, the background for her childhood was the Holocaust. And then there's a very distinguished film critic named Gerd Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R, who says this: the issue is a question. How do we incorporate this memory, which isn't ours? How do we incorporate the fact that we're third generation Holocaust people? We never had the experience of the camp. We never had the experience of being rounded up. We never had the experience of being tortured. But yet, how can we go on without acknowledging the traumatic impact of this inheritance? So for Gerd Bayer, the issue is, how do we incorporate this with our daily lives and move on, not while forgetting that part of our identity, but moving on with it? So there's plenty to unpack here throughout the genres that Vicky has established for us. What do we do with short stories? What do we do with films? What do we do with novels and narratives? There's one story by a woman, a German woman, Johanna Adorjan, who goes to various concentration camps with her father. Her father was a child survivor, born in a drawer in a chest of drawers in Vienna. He subsequently married a non-Jew. So Adorjan is not Jewish halakhically because her mother wasn't Jewish. However, she feels a special sense of kinship with Judaism and with Jews. When she goes to one of these concentration camps, she is visibly upset because the teenagers who are compelled to go on a field trip to this concentration camp are very busy talking on their cell phones, wanting to have a snack, generally disregarding the solemnity of the atmosphere and the place. I have to share with you one thing about torture. A friend suggests to her, why not go and try to meet some nice Jewish man you can marry? So she goes on J-Date, and she gets this response. Man, 35, would like to meet, okay? So she goes to this cafe in Germany, and the only other person, a male, is about 65 or 70. And Johanna says, well, he used to be 35, maybe 40 years ago, so that went nowhere. But the issue is that she feels this great sense of kinship to Jews and to the Holocaust, when it plays no visible part in her life. But she did hear certain stories from her father, and both of her parents wound up committing suicide. I recommend her work. I think it's very interesting. She's now a journalist for a German language newspaper.
You know, it's interesting because when Alan brought up the film The Flat, what we're seeing right now in 2024, 2023, 24, all these films that are coming out, as well as graphic novels and novels, more conventional novels and short stories and poems. And, you know, I'm thinking about Zone of Interest that many of you probably recently saw, that takes place outside the grounds of Auschwitz by Royal House and Family. And that's followed by, excuse me, a documentary that also just came out called The Commandant's Shadow. And it's about Hess's son and grandson, the son who grew up there on the grounds of Auschwitz, coming to terms or attempting to come to terms with the man and that his father and grandfather was. There's a new film that is going to be aired November 1st by Jesse Eisenberg called A Real Pain. And it's about Jesse Eisenberg, who's, you know, director and producer and also third generation. He and his cousin go back to Poland to follow in the steps of their grandmother and where she lived before she was deported to Auschwitz. So there's all this new material that is coming out. And one question we might get to if there's time at the end is why? Why now? Why is at this particular moment in our history is this happening? I have some thoughts on it, but before we do that, we wanted to talk initially about, as I said, survivor testimony. One of the tropes, the recurring patterns in survivor testimony is eyewitness accounts. And what we mean by witnessing, and one of the things that I'm really interested in is what do we mean when we talk about witnessing now and bearing witness now? It's one thing, of course, to talk about being a witness when you experience something. And as Elie Wiesel has said many times, but this is from Night, yes, I did see this with my own eyes. And as I say, this is a refrain throughout the literature. Gisela Pearl in I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz. Primo Levi in Survival in Auschwitz. This, well, as we can see with Pearl, I happened to have an errand near the crematories and saw with my own eyes what was done. This pattern, this repeated pattern with Primo Levi, the need to tell our story to the rest, to make the rest participate in, had taken on for us before our liberation and after the character of an immediate and violent impulse. So this refrain from those who lived to tell the story, that They saw it with their own eyes. They witnessed it. They experienced it. They lived through it. So there's direct witnessing, but there's also indirect witnessing. It's one thing to remember and express an event that you saw, that happened to you. It's another thing to remember something you never experienced. In this way, memory then becomes more of a metaphor, right? Because you can't really remember something you didn't experience. But this is something that the second generation and the third generation are continuing to grapple with. How can I be a witness to something I didn't witness? I didn't witness directly. And how do you define then Holocaust testimony, Holocaust narratives? There are two forms, basic forms of Jewish expression, midrash and lamentation. And midrash, of course, is a matter of continuing the story, midrashim, or stories, filling in the gaps, attempting to make sense of experience, to make sense of narratives, to make sense of events that happened, and of course also lamentation, an elegiac response to catastrophe. Both those forms we see throughout the literature. And in terms of indirect witnessing, Jonathan Safran Foer, of course, famously in the novel Everything is Illuminated, the grandson of Holocaust survivors, says, the origin of a story is always an absence that needs to be filled, a gap that needs to be filled in.
Yeah, I think that one of the differences between the Germans, writ broadly, and the Jews in the Holocaust is revealed in a short story about a shipment of prisoners who are being marched to the gas chamber to be gassed and subsequently cremated. And they're being marched under guard, of course, and suddenly one of the prisoners, evidently quite a beautiful young woman, grabs a gun from one of the guards and shoots one of the guards. And one of the guards says, as he's dying, my God, what have I done to suffer so? Which I think is quite revealing in terms of how the German Nazis viewed the Jews, not as a fellow human, but as a thing upon which one could experiment. And in fact, Hannah Arendt says the death camps were giant laboratories which served to prove that anything you could imagine could be achieved. And the issue for the films and the short stories and the novels, how do you communicate essentially what's incommunicable? How do you talk about what lies beyond words is ineffable? For Wiesel, of course, the question was, a novel about Auschwitz is either not about Auschwitz or not a novel. So what form do we look for? I think Vicky has pointed to these forms. It is a question, in my mind, of communicating what cannot be communicated, but what must be communicated. And this imposes severe challenges upon us as independent moral agents. What is this person trying to say? What is this person trying to communicate? It's not clear that we're up to the task, to put it mildly. How can you deal with someone who's confronting their own death? Think about that. It's a very difficult thing to do. And in these literary pieces and film pieces, we see what it means to communicate that. Just to go back to the second generation early part, there is a film called As If It Were Yesterday. It was made by two Belgian women, Esther Hoffenberg and Miriam Abramowitz. And in Belgium, there was a vast network of citizens who helped Jews hide and to escape. Now, today, if you see a male pushing a baby carriage, that's not a big deal. I mean, that's what husbands do when they're useful. But in 1942, if you saw a man pushing a baby carriage, that was a giveaway. That guy and that baby were marked for extermination. And so, there was this one man who was a high-ranking Jewish official who was in charge of placing Jewish children with Christian helpers. So, he gets a call one day from the Christian helper, and he says, "You must come and get the young man, the 8-year-old, right away. We no longer want to shelter." Well, what happened? So the Christian man, the farmer, says, "Well, he stole the baby Jesus from the Christmas creche." So the Jewish official goes to the house of the man and talks to the youngster. "What did you do?" And of course, initially the youngster denies having done anything. And then he said, "Well, I knew that Jesus was a Jew, and I knew that Germans were going to kill Jews. So I took the baby Jesus to hide him." Now, how do you communicate that? What was that young kid feeling? And of course, when the man told the farmer what the youngster had said, the farmer and his wife said, well, they embraced the child and kept him. But imagine the pressure that the helpers were under. A helper and his family could be shot summarily. No trial, no judge, no jury, just Nazis lined up with weapons ready to kill you. So the impetus to help was greatly hindered by the fact that you might be murdered at any given moment. And this is, how do you deal with this? It's what the literary critic Lawrence Langer called the choiceless choice. What kind of choice is that? And we compare it to the lives we live ourselves, relatively comfortable. We don't have those choices, thank God. And then, if you go to survivors for whom a police siren indicated something very different than it does for us, you're speeding down the highway, and you see the red flashing light of the police car in the rearview mirror, and you think, well, let me see, what's a good excuse I can give? It never worked for me. But for the survivor, it means I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be sent to prison. I don't know what I can do. So these cultural kids and the children of survivors, well, they look like you and I. Their English is very good. Not so for the survivors. Their English is lousy, typically. And they dress funny. But they're heroic because they survive a modern state's attempt to exterminate them. But yet survivors are not without flaws either. And as Vicki has pointed out in her discussion of Spiegelman, Arnie Spiegelman's father was a bigot. He was also a hero. So how do you deal with that? These are some of the dilemmas that the children and grandchildren face. And if you talk about the children of Nazis, their parents, their fathers, after the war, maybe 10, 15 years later, well, they're kind of on the fat side, and they don't wear shiny boots, and they don't carry sidearms. And suddenly the police come and they're saying, well, we're arresting your father for being a Nazi war criminal. We're just going to leave the kids. They don't know what's going on. So this Holocaust business has great repercussions. It's like throwing a boulder into a stream and there are ripples that come out. These are the ripples. And with the third generation, it's a challenge. I mean, how do you represent what you never experienced? How do you deal with that? How do you write a narrative? How do you express the fact that you've been impacted dramatically by an event you never witnessed? This is the issue.
And, you know, all the generations, from the survivor generation, second, third, remembrance is the key. And I think often of Susan Sontag here, who wrote, remembering is an ethical act, has ethical value in and of itself. Memory is achingly the only relation we can have with the dead. And again, as Alan is suggesting, how do you access memory? Memory is slippery for the survivor. Decades later, remembers. You know, memory is shaped by the demands of one's contemporary life, by the defenses of the ego, by necessity, by what you feel you can tell, by what you think the listener can take. And that's something that we really wanted to talk about, because testimony requires not only a teller, but a listener, an active listener, someone who knows how to listen, an engaged listener. I mean, testimony on the one hand, of course, is a transmission of information, as the late psychoanalyst and child survivor Dory Laub suggests, for which there is an internal unrelenting pressure to convey, as well as an external readiness and eagerness to receive it. It's an ethics of listening. And giving testimony necessarily depends upon a listener. If there's no one to listen, to witness the telling, to hear the stories of the traumatic past, then memories remain buried in the survivor's solitary interior psychic space. So it's this active participation of at least two people, of the teller and the recipient of that information. As Lawrence Langer puts it, after so many years the teller is given a chance to speak. We call that testimony. But more important is that we are given a chance to listen. And what we find in the literature is the way in which the reader or the viewer with film is either implicitly or explicitly or both drawn into the text. You know, we were talking about this with the students just before this lecture, and in almost all of survivor writing, there's this you listen. What would you do? The you becomes part of the narrative of telling, part of the process of remembering. And one thing I wanted to speak to was novelist Cynthia Ozick, the American Jewish novelist. She has argued against the tendency to find a redemptive meaning in Holocaust literature. She refers to that as a failure of moral rectitude. Nonetheless, she says, we want to find some redemptive measure. But she says it's a retroactive impulse, an anachronism. It does not suit the events themselves. No promise, no use, no restitution, and no redemption can come out of the suffering and destruction of 1/3 of the Jewish people. So how do we talk about the Holocaust? How do we talk about Holocaust memory? How do we listen? How do we become active, engaged, ethical witnesses? And that's the question for the second and the third generation. And one thing that Alan and I were thinking about is Helen Epstein, the child who wrote in Children of the Holocaust this: I had been trying to interest the New York Times in publishing an article on children of survivors with no success. There was no indication that such a group existed, I was told. There was no news peg, no event that made such an article fit to print in a newspaper. No one wanted to talk about it. No one wanted to hear about it. And I think that this is very important in terms of where we are now, because of course there's now a vast amount of literature by the children of survivors, exactly by the second generation. And I wanted to call your attention to Henri Roximov, the French second generation writer, who in a very interesting essay called Memory Shot Through with Holes writes this: a parenthesis was formed by the before and after, the pre-war and post-war. It was a frame in whose center lay silence. Only silence could evoke the horror. What happened between the before and the after, when the drama was played out, when all disappeared, was off limits to me. I had no right to speak of it. My question was not how to speak, but by what right could I speak? I, who was not a victim, a survivor, or witness. To ask, by what right could I speak, implies the answer, I have no right to speak. However, the time comes when you have to speak. And this is the dilemma for the children of survivors, those who grew up under the direct shadow of the Holocaust. By what right do I have to speak of memories that were not my own, but were bequeathed to me?
Yeah, I think the issue is ongoing, as indeed it must be. There was an Israeli novelist who unhappily passed long before her time, named Nava Semmel, and she wrote a novel called And the Rat Laughed. A strange kind of title, but this appeared, maybe 1998, 1999, just before the boom of the internet hit. And the novel is divided into 5 parts, but the issue is a grandmother living in Tel Aviv who's a survivor. And her granddaughter, as a school assignment, is assigned to interview the grandmother about her experience so she could share this with the class. So she goes to talk to her grandmother. And what happens next is, we're really not sure what happens next, because the grandmother invents a story about how she survived. Was the story she invented true or untrue? Well, pretty much untrue. But she didn't want to traumatize her granddaughter any further. And it gets more complicated because, of course, the Israelis have long experience with war and suffering and tragedies. And so, therefore, the Holocaust just becomes yet another in a series of tragedies. And that, of course, is what's happened in America to a large extent. What do you do with, there's another tragedy story? Well, today 14 people were murdered in a school. Tomorrow 6 more were murdered, will be murdered. We're unhappily being desensitized to mass murder. It's on every newspaper. So why should we pay attention to the Holocaust? What about other genocidal acts, Pol Pot in Cambodia, which has been described as an auto-genocide, where the nation decided to re-educate its citizens whom they deemed too influenced by Western culture. Well, the re-education, of course, consisted of murdering them. We have lots and lots of genocides. more genocide since the Holocaust than before. So what do we do with representation in that case? Well, back to Nava Samo's novel. The grandmother, the kids think the grandmother's really cool because she has mastered the internet. She was able to deal with the iPhones and cell phones. This was 1999, remember. And the story finally comes out that the grandmother had been saved during the Holocaust by a Christian family. P.S. The Christian family was paid for their help. And the Christian family's son would go down in the hole which they had dug for the grandmother as a child to hide in. And the son of the farmers would rape her every day. So naturally she didn't want to share that. But the other part of this, and the rat left, is the fact that the young child's life was saved by a Christian priest who hid her and saved her. And then another part of the novel, it's a 5 or 6 part novel, Nava Samo talks about 2 Israels. One Israel is pragmatic, lives from day to day, doesn't particularly concern itself with any historical events. The other Israel is ultra-religious, and they welcome the story of the grandmother until they find out that her life was saved by a Christian. Then they dismiss it. So this novel too raises lots of questions. What about the role of Jewish-Christian relations? Well, we know that, I'm not saying that Catholicism was genocidal, I think largely it wasn't, but they did sow the seedbed of the Holocaust with the teaching of contempt for Jews and Judaism. Of course, under Hitler, that contempt was turned into mass murder, extermination. It wasn't based so much on religion, but on race. The new Superman was 6 feet tall, blonde, blue-eyed, broad-shouldered, just like Hitler, right? So in any case, the issue was, how do you deal with Christian-Jewish relations? It's a major issue in Holocaust writings and film. It was much easier to go along with the crowd than it was to resist. And during those days, the resistance largely came, not solely, but largely came from the laity, and the lower ranking people. Now, since Nostra Aetate in 1965, this church apology, so to speak, the apologies come from the top, the Pope especially. So how do you put Jewish-Christian relations in the context of Holocaust? It's complicated. Look at Poland, for example. Many, many, many Poles were complicit in the murder of Jews. Yet, Poland had a national organization, Żegota, whose purpose was to try to help save Jews. The largest number of trees planted in memory of the righteous among the nations was planted for Poland. It's not that one cancels out the other, but it's just to let you know how complex the situation is. And many of the writers and tellers with whom Vicki and I deal, they had to live this contradiction. And how do you explain that contradiction? We've given some examples of people who have attempted that. And I think the other thing that we have to deal with is people, just ordinary people. Pierre Sauvage was born in the village of Le Chambon in southwestern France. He made a film called Weapons of the Spirit. And when she talks about the Chambonnais, the people of Le Chambon, who almost all were helpers, because that village was largely composed of Huguenots. The Huguenots had long centuries of experience of being persecuted. And he tells remarkable stories about how lives were saved. For example, the papers, the passports of the French Jews were hidden in beehives, and the Nazis were afraid to reach into the beehives because they might get stung. But then we learned, well, the beehives were empty, but the Nazis didn't know that. So just these little stories that make you consider what it means to be a human. It was far easier to go along with the murderers than to resist them. And far too many people did that. So I guess the question is never, what would you do in that situation? I think that's a false and phony and misleading question, because you would never know. But the better question is, which path will we follow? What path are we following in today's culture? Our culture is bitterly divided in this country. We see the rise of authoritarian regimes throughout the world. What challenges does this present to us? How do we respond to these challenges? I mean, this seems a bit far afield from the Holocaust literature and film, but I think it's directly related, because these people were faced with the same issues. And will we do better? Will we do worse? Will we do the same? We don't know. I mean, one guide we have is to keep reading and watching and listening to these testimonies. That may give us some kind of clue, and we are in need of clues. I mean, every day on the internet, you can get tons of filth. Well, the Holocaust never happened, it's a Jewish lie, blah, blah, blah. And lots of folks get their information on the internet. On the other hand, the internet is good if you do a lot of research, because it cuts your research time in half. You can also spend time chatting with friends. But we need to have some way of challenging the people who are spreading lies. And you know, there's a Yiddish proverb that says, the truth leads a wretched life. It does. It's a fragile plant that leads a wretched life. But it does lead a life. And we have to do what we can do to sustain this life. And I think that's what these Holocaust novelists and filmmakers are trying to do, is sustain our lives.
And I want it's 8:30. Okay, but I just wanted to, back to that question then of how do we talk about the Holocaust now? Really in the past 20 years, what we have seen is a rise in graphic narratives and graphic novels and graphic memoirs. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, that received the Pulitzer in 1992, was groundbreaking and in many ways changed the field, not only for comics representation, but certainly for Holocaust studies. But since then, I just wanted to point to two examples, one of a second generation and one of a third generation, because this is what we're seeing now. The commingling of text and image, of visuals and interspersed with dialogue, and they work together. And I wanted to point to two works. One is by the Canadian second generation writer Bernice Eisenstein, who famously has written a graphic memoir titled I Was a Child of Holocaust Survivors. Now, as you can see, casting behind her, it's sort of hard to see in this image, but there's shadows cast behind her. They're not her own shadows. They're the shadows of her parents. And she draws herself infantilized on the cover of this book as a young child, because she feels that her own life in many ways has been eclipsed by her own growing up, her own coming into herself has been eclipsed by the hugeness of the experience of her parents' trauma in Auschwitz. And, as I was saying in the beginning, this is this tension that we see in the literature between history, the history of the Holocaust with a capital H, the enormity, the millions of people, not only Jews, but certainly what we're talking about right now, it's Jewish writers, but also histories with a little h, the stories of individual people whose lives were so dramatically fractured and ruptured. Another example, well, and this is also from Eisenstein's book. I wanted you to see this because I think this really captures the second generation, and maybe even the third generation, but from her perspective of the second generation, this is an image that she's tried to reconstruct from her mother's stories of the barracks in Auschwitz, where her mother was interred. And as we can see, you've got the barracks, but in front of the barracks are these trees whose branches, denuded branches, reaching up like spikes into the sky. But then you've got the barbed wire. The second generation is on the other side of the barracks, on the other side of the trees, on the other side of the barbed wire, outside the frame. But the way in which that internal picture and the barbed wire and the branches of the trees bleed into the blue of the present is the embodiment of the way in which the past history of her parents bleeds into her own life. And this tension between proximity and distance. She can only see it from this distance. She can only get so close. And a really interesting third generation graphic narrative by Amy Kurzweil, called Flying Couch. It opens in this way. So her grandmother escaped the Warsaw Ghetto while the rest of the family was murdered. The book begins with the transcribed oral narrative of her grandmother's testimony that you can see in that top image. As it opens, as the book of these stories open, and the words tumble and spiral down the page, the house is built. The house that eventually Amy Kurzweil, the third generation, grows up in with her parents. It's a house that is built on the foundation of the house, the stories of the traumatic past. And it's a very complex image, as you can tell, because on the one hand, these stories would suggest solidity, a foundation, a structure for a house. But on the other hand, that last image is exposed. We get that bird's eye view of the house, which is open, it's vulnerable to the traumatic history. Also, what is so noticeable here is as the stories come out of that book of the transcribed oral testimony, the stories fall apart, the letters scatter, the words open up. And as they go down, they also, of course, come up out of the smokestack, out of the chimney, reminiscent of course, the smoke from the crematoria. So you can see this tension for the third generation. And I really wanted you to look at this, although I'm now probably in the way of this one. So here you've got this, I think, just a stunning dual page, this 2-page spread, where you've got the 3 generations. So you've got the grandmother who survived the Warsaw Ghetto, her daughter, Amy Kurzweil's mother, second generation, who was born in a DP camp, and then Amy Kurzweil, the third generation. They're walking down a road together. And of course, it's a path that leads them into the past, with the grandmother's seemingly offhand observation when she says, "Did I ever tell you that you have my sister's eyes, my baby one with black eyes?" The mother, Amy Kurzweil's mother, the second generation, doesn't want to hear it. She grew up in a DP camp. She wants to remake her life in America. She doesn't want that history to be her own. And she says, "My eyes aren't even black." But the grandmother and the granddaughter turns to the grandmother. The mother is now off stage in the back. When the granddaughter looks at her grandmother in her reflective glasses, she doesn't see her own image. She sees the image of the dead sister who died of starvation in the Warsaw Ghetto. So she looks into this moment of transference and fantasized identification. And what is both disturbing and really fascinating in this uncanny way is that the image of the dead child who is still alive in the memory of the grandmother looks an awful lot like the way in which the third generation graphic artist draws herself. Because part of her own life is eclipsed by the enormity of her grandmother's experience. But she can come close. She can come close enough in this fantasized imagination based on the stories, even the scantest of references that her grandmother gives, but in a recognition of the limitations of knowledge for someone who wasn't there. You turn the page and her glasses are once again blackened. She's the only one on the page because those finally are her memories alone. And so the frustration on the part of the third generation graphic novelist here is that she can come close, but she can only go so far in the imagination. We're out of time, I'm so sorry, but we will open it to questions.
Hi, thank you. I've heard often in the past about children of survivors actually growing up in silent households. That there was no talk, there was no memory, there was just a silence because it was just too hard. And parents didn't want to burden children. And I guess that's a memory that also you pull through. So that's all. I mean, I just wanted to point that out.
I think you're quite right, and the issue is that you either grew up in a house where the parents were silent, or you grew up in a house where they couldn't stop talking about it. One thing. Second thing is, there was always one of the children that was designated as the bearer of the history. One might be completely opposed to it, ignore it, not interested in it, but another would be shouldering the burden. You're absolutely right.
And what you often hear from the children of survivors are references to walking into a room and parents who stop talking, or the fixation on the tattoos. And when parents would be asked, well, where did that come from? Again, there's silence. And so then you get this sort of, these fantasies. And at this, it's interesting with, and this is a pattern as well, but Bernice Eisenstein, in her memoir, I Was a Child of Holocaust Survivors, refers to her parents, her anxiety growing up, that her parents had this other family that she could never know, never be a part of, but also these references to survivor families, survivor communities, that we hear this very often, that Eisenstein talks about her parents, that she recognizes that they had more in common with, and in some ways were more comfortable among other survivors than she feared they were with their own children. And so it's so complicated. But so you have on the one hand either this kind of silence, or you have parents who talk about it regularly. To borrow a line from Spiegelman's mouse, when his father says, let me tell you this just in case.